Welcome to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where we trade in personal finance advice for entertaining conversations about money, millennials, and the young at heart. Welcome, world, to yet another episode of the award-winning television show and podcast. Yes, indeed. Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. I'm joined here by my co-host, Mr. Malcolm Ethridge. What's going on, Malcolm? How are you?
Man, same old. Another day, another dollar, as you like to say.
Indeed. You know, I had a realization recently that in the ways of, corporate lingo, there's a term that is like getting on my nerves right now, or a phrase, I should say. That phrase is fireside chat. I really don't like when people say, I had a fireside chat, because I went and looked up what fireside means, and it means you're like talking by a fire. And
you
all
had
these
to look that up to get the
context of. I was so irritated. I was like, why do people keep using this phrase that has nothing to do with speaking on a panel or standing on stage and talking to someone?
I can't get there with you. All of the corporate buzzwords and lingo that there is to be annoyed by, that's not the one that does it.
It wasn't originally, but I've seen it recently over and over again.
Like when people say, I'm going to ping you, that just drives me crazy. Like, say you're going to send me an email. Like, come on.
The thing that you always say, or have said in the past, that to me serves as like the headline for all of those is, let's circle the wagon.
Oh, there's so many of them. Like,
The first time you said circle the wagons, I don't know if I had heard that before, and yet it was still very like emblematic of what those kinds of phrases mean.
You ever watch House of Lies on Showtime?
No.
With Don Cheadle. It's about business consultants, like a McKinsey or a Deloitte consulting, somebody like that, and his team and the words and lingo they throw around the room the whole time they're having a meeting with the client. And it's really funny because it's like poking fun at those kind of things where they're, let's circle the wagons and talk about this. Or let's dive right in and like all those things.
Loathsome.
Yeah.
Anyway, so please, people, stop saying fireside chat, please, for me.
Good luck.
Indeed. Well, on this episode, we're going to be covering, will millennials ever be able to retire? That's the conversation at hand for this episode. But before we get into that, as we do on every show, it is now time for headlines. Hedge funds not led by white men outperform nearly 2-1. This is a January 2020 piece on Bloomberg.com by Jeff Green, and it reads, hedge funds not controlled by white men had returns almost double their peers the last 3 years, according to a Bloomberg analysis of hedge fund data. Within Bloomberg's database of 2,900 funds, the analysis found 35 managed by minorities or women and compared them with 908 peer funds. The database includes over 65% of the industry's top 1,500 managers by assets under management, so the amount of money they have under management. Hedge funds either controlled or managed by a minority or female leader had a return of about 6.6 return over the past 3 years, compared to 3.9% for their peers. The analysis of the Bloomberg hedge fund data found macro funds, which invest in broad global trends, had the biggest disparity. During the past 5 years, the funds not managed by white men outpaced their peers by about 41%. The data showed, Malcolm. So what was your initial reaction to this story, Malcolm?
It's kind of funny, well, not ha-ha funny, but like irony funny.
Yeah.
That it confirms that old saying in the black community about being twice as good to get half as much. Like, literally, we're talking about returns that are twice as good. But as you know, the data shows, they don't even have half as much of the funds to allocate. So the way that it works in the world of a fund manager, the more people who believe in you and believe that you're smart and qualified and good enough at what you do, the more people that trust you with their money, the more you can actually go out and invest and execute some of those good ideas that you have. So if you have, say $100 million that you manage, you only have $100 million to manage. So there's only so many shares of so many companies that you can buy. But if you've got $100 billion to manage, there's a lot more opportunity for you to execute some of those really great ideas that you have.
Yeah.
But the performance that you're talking about still hasn't quite lent itself to people saying, I'm going to allocate my money with the people who have shown themselves to be the best stock pickers or the best company pickers or whatever, whatever.
Those two things don't go together.
They clearly don't actually align, which is amazing to me. But then at the same time, it's like, tell me water is wet and I'm going to have the same reaction.
Indeed. We've had conversations on the show about diversity, specifically in the financial management space and whatnot. What does a story like this suggest for I guess, I don't even know what the word is to call it, the juxtaposition or some word such as that, between the fact that these groups that we're talking about, women and minorities, are performing better literally on paper, and yet they still have a certain lack of opportunity to these high stake, so to speak, roles in the financial management world.
So, as with most things in the United States that relate to race relations and diversity and inclusion and everything else, it requires some sort of initiative that becomes a rule, that becomes a law, that becomes just the way things are.
Right.
And what has happened in the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, but maybe 5 just to cover myself.
I wonder what that could be about. But continue.
There's a lot of rules that have popped up with like pension funds, for example, which are really huge allocators of money on behalf of the people who are invested in those pensions as the employees in the companies that stand to receive those benefits, where now by mandate, they've got to actually have, say, 5% of that fund managed by a firm that's 51% minority owned, 51% woman owned, or some variation of that.
I see.
And that then means that those people who haven't gotten a chance to really shine yet because their pools of capital that they manage are so much smaller are now getting exposure in a way that they wouldn't have before because people have to go to them by mandate of, their finance committee, basically, who determined this, which, I think is going to show some meaningful results as long as all things remain equal and the returns that they're able to show stay about the same.
Indeed. So, question for you, and maybe this is an opportunity to be a cynic. Will industries wake up to the monetary value of opening up leadership positions to minorities and women? And with that, I want to remind you can catch past episodes of Manage Your Damn Money on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. Of course, if you have any questions for us or thoughts you want to send us or a topic you want us to cover, send it to us, info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. Of course, you can always catch us on social media. My handle's @MYDM1. Malcolm, what's yours?
@MalcolmOnMoney.
And that's on Instagram and Twitter. And you can always catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/manageyourdamnmoney. This is the eternal cynical place for you.
I mean, you asked the resident skeptic.
It is MYDM with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where today's conversation at hand is, will millennials ever be able to retire? The word millennial seems to be synonymous with the idea of youth. 30-year-olds with no kids going to Coachella, hitting brunch every weekend, and still visiting their favorite bar for an occasional Thirsty Thursday. Does that describe you? I'll wait. Despite some of it, right? Despite our sense that we just might be able to pull off living forever, the truth is even millennials will one day get old. So it begs the question, will millennials ever be able to retire? Without pension funds, a boatload of student loan debt, and a seemingly shaky Social Security infrastructure, say that 3 times fast, it isn't clear yet whether or not our generation will have the chance to comfortably hang it up and call it a career. That's why on this episode of MYDM, we are exploring what it will take for the millennial generation to experience, hopefully, a somewhat moderately marginal, what other kinds of words can I put in there, retirement, Malcolm. So when I say millennials and retirement, what initial thoughts come to your mind?
That sounds so far away.
Okay.
Like, I'm a millennial myself. I'm 32 years old. Retirement is something that's supposed to happen in your mid to late 60s.
Correct.
That's more than half my lifetime I've lived already. So it sounds and feels so far away.
That's an authentic answer. For me, that's not the reaction that I have. The reaction I have is, I don't know if I'm gonna get to do that. And I probably might end up working somewhere as a 60-year-old, and that'll be that. And I'll just have to work until I can't work anymore. That's my thinking.
Honestly, I mean, I assume at some point I'll have the ability to, from a financial perspective, to say, like, I've done enough and I don't have to work anymore. I really don't think I'm going to retire, though. Like, I just don't see that as a thing that I would allow myself to do.
You've said that before.
I would die of boredom. Like, I need something to do to be able to, like, feel like I accomplished something today.
Right.
Otherwise, the day was a waste and it'll drive me crazy.
Indeed, indeed. Well, a little bit of history for you folks, because we always like to provide the proper context. The history of retirement, and this was according to Wikipedia, retirement, or the practice of leaving one's job or ceasing to work after reaching a certain age, has been around since around the 18th century. Retirement as a government policy began to be adopted by countries during the late 19th century and the 20th century. Prior to the 18th century, the average life expectancy of people was between 26 and 40 years. Due to this, only a small percentage of the population were reaching an age where physical impairments began to be obstacles to working. I mean, if you're 50, I mean, there's no obstacle to working there.
Physically?
Yeah, physically or otherwise.
I don't know, man. These knees.
Retirement as a concept began to be widely adopted in the United States after the period of the Industrial Revolution, where numerous aging factory workers began to show signs of aging, slowing down assembly lines, taking excessive sick days, and usurping the spots of more youthful, more profitable men with families to bolster. I don't know why that made me laugh.
Reminds you of a totally different time.
Yeah, a little bit. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed the Social Security Act of 1935, which made workers pay for their own particular retirement. So NerdWallet's 2015 new grad retirement report that we pulled for this show, NerdWallet's analysis finds the class of 2015 faces a retirement age pushed back to 75, 2 years later than what the class of 2013 could expect because of increasing student loan debt, rising rents, and millennials' approach to money management. Oh my God. Student debt can end up costing college graduates around $684,000 in lost retirement savings over a 50-year period. And rising rents paired with student debt have pushed back the retirement age for new graduates. So Malcolm, does retirement as we understand it today, does it feel relatively new, conceptually speaking, or do we think the 18th century is like an old enough concept that it maybe is viable today?
So your question is, do we think of the way retirement works now like our parents? Is that viable?
In my mind, retirement is kind of a new concept, specifically for, I think of my grandparents who were retired longer than they worked, and how they were able to do that was, my grandmother said, don't call it her pension. She said, calls it her retirement. Her retirement afforded her the opportunity to do that, but that was a bill that was foot by a municipality in California for the duration of, the time that both her and my grandfather were living. So it's just one of those things where it's like, it made sense maybe at the time, but conceptually, I don't know if that's going to be a thing for us as millennials.
Well, there has to be some variation of it. Do I think that it'll exist in the same way that it did for your grandmother? For us,
Right, exactly.
Absolutely not.
Right.
But if you think about some other things that have hung over since then, like the 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job schedule came out of the Industrial Revolution.
It
and
did.
Millennials are trying their best to kill that, among other things that we're responsible for killing, right? Like
Right.
we've had conversation on the show about the 4-hour work week and how long it'll
Right.
take us to get there. So there's a lot of things that, they made sense at the time, but they may not make sense going forward. But I would just say with Social Security, us having conversation about whether we'll have to be 70 or 75 or whatever to receive it, any slice of it at some point, people are talking about it not being necessary and it not being that much there when we get there. But there's still a significant portion of the United States that lives on Social Security as their only source of income in retirement right now.
Yeah.
So with that said, we're talking about the greatest generation, quote unquote, who bought the house with the picket fence and had 2.5 kids and a dog and all that stuff, has the pension that's gonna last them longer than when they actually were working. And people still haven't saved anything meaningful beyond that. So it's like, on one hand, it sounds great to say you all need to do a better job of saving for your future.
Right.
But on the other hand, I have to look at the math and say you didn't do a good job of saving for your future. Hence the reason I have to save twice as much to get anything meaningful in retirement. So I say all that to say, I don't think it's sustainable to think that retirement will look the same for our generation as it did for, quote unquote, the greatest generation or boomers.
That's a poignant point, because when I think about retirement, I think of my grandparents, and that is obviously not going to be a situation that I experience, or that I can speak for myself and say I probably won't live that experience later on. This NerdWallet report, this class of 2015 NerdWallet report, identifies high rents and student debt as barriers to saving for retirement. It's an interesting thing that at the very moment that you're coming out into the world, you have these massive things to pay for. Talk to me a little bit about how that loss affects the ability to save down the line, just in very basic terms.
So who I'm more concerned about in the whole class of millennials, because there's some of us who are elder statesmen, as we like to call ourselves, and then there's the younger millennials who are like just recent college grads. But there's those of us that fell into what I call the lost decade, where you graduated college between 2008 and 2018, where we were putting out resumes to apply for jobs, competing against people with PhDs and 10 years of work experience, looking for the same job.
Children of the Great Recession,
At
you might call it.
Starbucks, mind you, not like looking for the same job at some high-level corporation and you were punching above your weight.
Right.
I was just trying to get paid, and so was Jeff, right? And so we're competing for that. And so that decade really defined, I think, the finances of an entire half of our generation, and not in a good way, because rents being higher, it matters, but it also doesn't matter nearly as much as it does if your salary is already depressed to begin with. So you have people who are graduating from college right now, they're like, oh man, this is terrible. I've got all these student loans. My job doesn't pay me enough. And my response is, try graduating in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12.
We did it.
So, and I don't say that to say like their issue isn't an issue. I say that to say we're all in it in the same like boat. So I don't know. We'll see, how much of an impact it has long term. But coming out of school and your ability to just afford rent
in that era,
and that not be more than 75% of your paycheck, your take home pay, is a huge deal. So just starting there and seeing the significant impact it has made on people and kind of delayed your ability to become an adult, so to speak. I think that's going to have a very lasting effect.
Yeah, definitely. We both came out in that era, 2009, graduates of college. I went to graduate school in 2010.
A lot of people were like, forget this, I'm going back to school.
Well, I had already exercised that option a year earlier. So we'll see what happens when you see me, at least on the corner with my mug. Don't pass me by. Well, we're going to take another quick music break. But when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about, will millennials ever be able to retire? But as we go to music break, I want to remind you can catch the show as a podcast on Apple Podcast, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. Please leave us a review and a rating on any of those platforms. That helps more people catch the show. And of course, if you have a topic you want us to cover, send it to us. info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. You can always catch us on social media, Instagram and Twitter. My handle's @MYDM1. Malcolm, what's yours?
@Malcolm on Money.
And you can catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/manageyourdamnmoney. This is MYDM with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where we are discussing whether or not millennials will ever be able to retire. And another piece that we pulled for this show, millennials are the new face of the retirement crisis. I'm sorry, Malcolm, I have more bad news for you. This is an August 2019 piece on MarketWatch.com by Mark Holbert. You think you are facing a retirement finance crisis? Consider the millennial generation, those born between 1981 and 1996. Starting this year, they become the largest living generation in the United States. This was an opinion piece covering research of how will retirement savings change by 2050, prospects for the millennial generation. The researchers first focused on advantages millennials have as they save and invest for their retirement relative to previous generations. They then enumerated their relative disadvantages, and it's no contest. The list of those disadvantages is far longer. Dum dum dum. Anyways, when it comes
Go figure.
Right, when it comes to the advantages, the researchers could come up with just one. Millennials as a group are more educated than any previous generation, which should translate into significantly greater earning potential. Note it says potential. The researchers
Eventually.
right. The researchers also point to a second potential advantage, but in the end, it turns out to be a double-edged sword. Millennials as a group are healthier and thus should be able to work until more advanced age than previous generations. That in turn should enable them to save and invest more of their retirement. The double-edged sword, however, is that millennials are also likely to live longer than previous generations and thus must fund a longer retirement. It's all bad news here, Malcolm. These two effects could very well cancel one another out. And then the article goes on to enumerate the disadvantages that the millennial generation has. Millennials' careers have gotten off to a rocky start because of the financial crisis, the exact thing that you identified, Malcolm, and the ensuing slow recovery over the subsequent few years. As a group, therefore, they are not exploiting the full potential of the theoretical advantage afforded to them by their great educational attainment. So, like, as I've read, I'm realizing there are no advantages according to this person writing this particular opinion piece.
You wrote this?
I did not. I did not. But Malcolm, question for you. In the end, how big of an impact will the Great Recession have on our generation?
Huge.
Okay.
Huge.
Okay.
Huge. I was gonna say bigly, and I decided but the reason I say that is because this gigantic gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
You keep hearing about the wealth gap and income disparity and all that kind of stuff that are significant problems in this country.
Yeah.
But the way that those things come to be and the way they get worse is during economic downturns, because the have-nots are scrambling to figure out how to make it from day to day.
Right.
And the haves are scrambling to figure out how to cash in on this misfortune of other people. So you have to imagine people who needed to sell their home, for example. The housing market suddenly is bad. That doesn't change my need to sell my house. I have to sell it for less. Probably going to sell it at a loss now because I'm desperate. A have can come in and buy that house for a discount now and pad their pockets down the road because they have the money to take that longer term look and have the cushion there. So things like that come along in recessions that go a long way to create that bigger gap. And then every time they happen, the cycle repeats and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. And then so it's drawing people further and further apart.
And then as to your point, wealth actually, consolidates into fewer and fewer hands.
Right. So fewer people control everything.
Right.
Because if you control the money, that means you also control the companies that the people who are the have-nots are working for.
Wow.
So think
Through
Walmart
stocks.
or Amazon, for example, who are some of the largest companies in this country. They also employ a lot of the people in this country. But those are not necessarily the jobs that the people at the higher end of the income spectrum will have. So they have a lot less leeway with what they can and cannot say and do and whatever else, and they're more at the mercy of the owners of Walmart. So that kind of disparity creates that gap that we're talking about further and further, which means you're set up for failure before you even get to play the game.
It sounds like to me that the Great Recession of 2008 and I guess 2009 will literally end up defining the millennial generation in a lot of ways for our financial prospects and outlook.
Unfortunately so. Well, I will say this though. So you mentioned that the author of that particular piece never actually gave us one single advantage after all that bleak list of doom and gloom. And I don't want this to sound like the doom and gloom show. So I will point out the fact that as you mentioned at the very top of it, millennials as a generation are more educated as a whole than any other generation before us, which means that there's a lot more brain power that is working these jobs and not so much manual labor, which means that from the retirement perspective, you can afford to work a little longer because you're not physically having to do a task. Also, it means that you're able to have sort of a second encore career, as you will, leveraging that expertise as maybe a consultant, a board director, something like that, where you're not having to work the regular 40, 50, 60-hour work week that you normally would. You're able to lean on your expertise and kind of help bring that into the younger folks behind you to make that education count.
You know, optimism looks good on you, sir. It kind of glows off your face a little bit. You should try it a little bit more often. To go back to the disadvantages real quick, because that's what the story
Ray of sunshine over here.
Indeed. To a greater extent than prior generations, millennials will be employed in quote-unquote contingent jobs, the gig economy, that provide little or no automatic enrollment in or contributions to any retirement programs, partly because of these first two disadvantages, and also because they have more student debt than prior generations. Millennials have lower net worths than previous generations. Millennials also are marrying and buying homes and having children later in life than previous generations. Malcolm, as you mentioned, the story writer says greater inequality is a component. This is a disadvantage because it means that unless a millennial is among the generation's very wealthy folks, chances are greater that he or she will be among the very worst off, which is the perfect, matchup against the Walmart example that you just gave. And then finally, millennials will inevitably feel the financial burden of whatever the government does to make up the funding shortfalls facing Social Security and Medicare. As have been widely discussed, for example, the Social Security Trust Fund is currently slated to run out of money in 2034, which isn't that far away, at which point it will be able to pay just 79 cents of every dollar that is otherwise obligated. That comes a decade or more prior to when the millennial generation enters retirement, of course. By definition, any solution to that or shortfall will involve either higher taxes that would hit millennials or lower benefits or both. So they're hitting on both ends.
On the Social Security conversation, the thing I think a lot of people are missing in that conversation is the fact that right now, as it stands, Social Security is not fully funded and never has been and probably never will be.
As we sit here.
But it's still perfectly viable that there's 2 or 3 generations of people who are living off of it on a regular basis. As I mentioned, it's a lot of Americans' sole means of income in retirement. And I say that to say, if it's not fully funded, where are they getting the money? From the workers like us who are paying into Social Security today to fund our future benefits, when in reality, the goal is just you people need to make enough babies that they go get jobs that they can fund Social Security for you. That's basically what it is. We are funding Social Security for our parents.
Is a hilarious Ponzi scheme.
It's the world's biggest, most successful Ponzi scheme. But I say that all to point out our generation as millennials is the largest living generation in the country right now, which means that we are successfully propping up the boomers and the greatest generation before them. But then when you look at Gen Z, they are expected to be a larger generation of people than us in populace, which then means that
we're going to live on
our kids and grandkids, unfortunately, will be paying into the system the same way with no guaranteed funding for themselves, but guaranteed funding for mom and dad and grandma and grandpa because that's the way the system works. So if I were them being the government, I'd be really focused on getting more people out of the gig economy and into jobs that are full-time and actually pay a Social Security wage so that I have those funds to go into the coffers to make up that next generation's funding requirement. Because right now, this whole gig economy thing means you're not paying those Social Security employment taxes at nearly the same level you would if you were a W-2 full-time employee.
Definitely. Well, another piece of article that we pulled for this, and hopefully will be a ray of sunshine for you. Millennials are determined to retire early. Here's how they can actually pull it off. This was an August 2019 piece on NBCnews.com by Nicole Spector. Get strategic about paying down student debt. Facing down student loan debt can be daunting, but it's imperative to pay it off strategically. Don't skimp on your 401k contributions. So how do you elevate your preparation? For starters, you need to be dumping as much money as you can into your 401k plan. That means at or above the level at which you get matched at your company. Also, if you fall below the income limits, because there are income limits, regardless of whether you have a 401k, millennials should also opt into a Roth IRA, which allows them to set aside $5,500 of their annual income. And I did a Roth IRA, I should say, for a long time until I got married, in which the tax equation kind of changed a little bit. And so keep that in mind when you're thinking about a Roth IRA. And then also consider rethinking retirement altogether. Retirement doesn't need to include a complete end to working, says a person quoted for this particular story. Millennials can develop unique skills to earn money on demand through side hustles, as you mentioned, Malcolm, contracting, or being part of a part-time small business owner's operations, Malcolm. So at least in this show, it feels like almost everything is all bad, right?
Well, here's one other big elephant in the room that like doesn't go into these pieces because it's extremely crass to bring up, and I recognize that before I bring it up.
Okay.
But there is this.
Everybody brace yourself. Go ahead.
There is this whole thing that's been floating around there called the Great Wealth Transfer. That's going to happen at some point in the near future. So Prudential Insurance Company has done this study that says every day 10,000 people turn 65, 65 being the normal retirement age for a lot of the government metrics. So if at that point we are the kids of the people who are in that group that are turning 65, they can't and won't live forever. Those assets have to transfer to somewhere, to someone. And so for some of the folks who are born into those families who have parents who have been diligent enough about saving that they don't end up spending it all to fund their own retirement, some of that transfers down to the next generation. And maybe that is the thing that ends up saving us from falling off a cliff as far as society is concerned.
So all of our hope lies outside of our control is what you just said, at least in some way.
A lot of this lies outside of our control, unfortunately.
Indeed. Well, that which we can do, what should people do, or what should people do with this information to make changes or adjustments for what they're doing for themselves?
I think it's important to remember how fast time flies.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that like 65, I look at that and I say I haven't even been alive for half of 65. So how could I conceptualize what it's going to be to retire and it be a meaningful conversation?
Yeah.
But with that said, I can conceptualize how fast the last 10 years of my life have just gone.
Oh, yeah.
So graduated from college and here I am.
Right.
It kind of feels like it happened that fast in some cases.
Yes, it does.
So then that means that 30 years that I'm talking about, or 35 years roughly that I'm talking about between now and full retirement age, is probably going to blow by even faster than that. So understanding that it does move fast.
Speaking of time, and a completely unrelated thing, but I remember summer times in like the first grade were mad long. Like it would have felt like you were away from school for a whole year.
Yeah.
And then when I got to middle school, summers were like cool, but like I was like, all right, we're back. And then by high school, a summer seemed real short.
In high school?
Yeah, like
The summer that just passed as a grown adult man felt like 5 seconds. At least in high school, it was kind of like, all right, this is cool.
I had a economics teacher at John Muir High School in Pasadena, California. His name is Chuck Maloof. And he used to always tell us, I don't know how old Chuck Maloof is because he looked 70 when I was there and I went back for my 10-year reunion. He looked exactly the same. He said something like this. He said, when you get to be my age, years go by like weekends. And that is becoming true. And it's to your point, like, 35 years feels like a long way away, but really it kind of isn't. And I can say for myself, especially now having kids, like I feel like I'm now behind on literally every goal I ever had when it comes to finances.
So just understanding that forever doesn't last forever, right? Like people always, oh, that's forever away. I have time. I have time. But really that first 5-ish years after you graduate from college is probably that time that really sets the table for everything else that's gonna come and what habits you have and don't have.
Yeah, definitely. Well, on that, we're gonna close this episode of Manage Your Damn Money. I want to remind you can catch past episodes of Manage Your Damn Money on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. Please leave us a review or a rating on any of those platforms. That helps more people catch the show. If you want to send us a question or a topic that you want us to cover, send it to us, info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. You can always catch us on Instagram, Twitter. My handle's @MYDM1. Malcolm, what's yours?
@MalcolmOnMoney.
You can catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/ManageYourDamnMoney. Thanks to our partners here at Montgomery Community Media once again for their amazing hospitality. Until next time, be good with your money.
Peace.
Peace.